Good day. This is Rhonda reading from the Lost Gospel, the Book of Q and Christian Origins by Burton L. Mack. Part 3, Removing the Patina. Biblical scholars always assume a community behind their texts. And New Testament scholars have always thought that the earliest followers of Jesus immediately formed a Christian congregation. That is what Luke reports, and Matthew and John. Mark's ending seems to allow for it, and Paul's letter to the Galatians tells us that Cephas and James were residing in Jerusalem as quote unquote pillars of some group of Jesus people in the mid 50s CE. If the importance of Jesus, excuse me, if the importance of Jesus was his role in starting the Christian religion, or so the reasoning has been, the first followers must have been Christians. It may not have been easy to start a new religion with fishermen and such, especially when the large scale plan required coming to see that Jesus was the Christ who came to transform the world by dying for it. But surely the dramatic events of the crucifixion, the resurrection, and the appearances to the women and disciples took care of that. So the first church in Jerusalem must have blossomed overnight, or at least not later than Luke's 40 days. When Q came into view as a text, scholars naturally began to talk about the community of Q. Just as naturally, they thought of the community of Q as the earliest form of Christian congregation. Some even used the term church to refer to what must have been the obvious result when people recognized Jesus as the Christ. What did it matter if they recorded his teachings in a document that did not tell all? Surely they must have been Christians. As interest grew in knowing more about the community of Q, however, studies began to appear that bumped up against features of the text that did not seem to fit the standard scenario etched in the Christian imagination. Not only was there no reference to the death and resurrection of Jesus, no mention of Jesus as the Christ, and no instruction to Peter and the other disciples about continuing Jesus' mission and baptizing converts into the church, the instructions in Q were couched in curious, aphoristic discourse addressed to individuals and recommended strange public behavior. So the first attempts at describing the community of Q aimed at understanding how these odd features of the text could be made to fit the traditional picture of Christian origins. Gerd Thiessen took note of the strange public behavior called for throughout the document, such as the instruction to sell one's possessions and give to everyone who begs, not to worry about what to eat, about leaving home to follow Jesus, and to give your shirt to the person who grabs your coat. He also noted the connection between injunctions like these and instructions for working in the harvest, where Jesus' followers are told not to carry money or purse. Thiessen, 1973, first proposed that the Q people were itinerant charismatics who imitated the radical lifestyle of Jesus, acting out their commitment to his message of the kingdom of God by means of the curious behavior enjoined, such as voluntary poverty and begging. When this did not seem to satisfy the traditional picture of Christian beginnings or to account for all the sayings in Q, he went on to suggest that the Christian movement consisted of settled Christian communities as well as itinerants. 1977. According to this view, the Q itinerants were actually missionaries who received their support from the settled communities where they were recognized as Christian prophets. In exchange for supporting the itinerant prophets, the communities received Christian proclamation and instruction. Since that seemed to fit with the picture of Paul's missionary activity and seemed to agree with Paul's description in Galatians 2, verses 7 to 8, of two missions, one to Jews and one to Gentiles, Thiesen's proposal sounded plausible. Richard Edwards in 1976 noted the uneasy mix of wisdom, prophecy, and apocalyptic language in Q, and that the Christology of Q was not yet clearly Christian. The only role for Jesus that might be considered Christian, according to Edwards, was that the people of Q expected his return as the Son of Man. Edwards therefore argued that the mix of sayings was justified theologically, and that the early Son of Man Christology, quote unquote, was called for in light of Jesus's eschatological message and his resurrection from the dead. Since that seemed to fit the standard Christian scenario, no one bothered to ask Edwards how he knew that the people of Q thought that Jesus had been raised from the dead when they made no mention of it. Eugene Boring, in 1982, suggested that the Q people were ecstatic prophets who continued to proclaim the kingdom by speaking in Jesus' spirit and name. They could do this because they understood themselves to be filled with the Spirit of Jesus as the risen Lord. Q was their handbook of instructions for the mission, and the material in Q was the substance of what they preached. For a while, Boring's book was eagerly read, for it all but erased any differences between the people of Q and the standard view of Christian origins. And besides, Boring's appeal to the ecstasy of dramatic spiritual experience was difficult to counter. It complemented so well a long history of Christian desire to anchor religious authority in a miraculous and mysterious event of spiritual transformation. So much the better if that event effected the transformation, not only of Jesus, but of his ecstatic followers as well. Excuse me. But studies such as these eventually failed to convince the careful readers of Q as the 1980s unfolded. In a 1987 dissertation, Leaf, Vaage, I'm assuming it's pronounced Vage, made 2 points that nicely summed up an emerging scholarly consensus about the best approach to Q. Vage argued for a strict adherence to the text of Q when interpreting any given saying and when reconstructing its social context. He showed that both Thiessen and Boring had based their work on a large number of assumptions about Christian origins that were not appropriate to the text of Q. Vague's own findings, based largely on the harvest instructions, were that Q was interested mainly in behavior and lifestyle, and that the lifestyle called for in Q was much closer to patterns of behavior characteristic of cynics in the Hellenistic tradition of popular philosophy than to the descriptions given by Thiessen and Boring for Christian charismatic prophets. Since others had been finding similar discrepancies between the tenor of Q and the traditional interpretation of its sayings, It was clear that the conventional picture of Christian origins was not helping in the attempt to understand Q. The time seemed right for a concerted effort to read Q apart from the standard scenario of Christian beginnings and try to catch sight of the people of Q as they might have looked in their own social world. In 1988, the Q seminar of the Society of Biblical Literature turned to the question of the community of Q. Kloppenborg's identification of three layers of textual tradition in Q had already become an acceptable working hypothesis for the seminar, and notations had been created in order to refer to each layer. The earliest layer, consisting of sapiential instruction, was now referred to as Q, an announcement of judgment as Q2. Kloppenborg had also identified a small amount of material that had been added later than the composition of Q2, such as the story of Jesus' temptation. These later additions were referred to as Q3. I will use these shorthand designations when referring to the several layers of the Q tradition. In the English translation of the text presented in Part 2, the material assigned to each of these layers has been set in a different typeface. At the seminar, Kloppenborg and I each presented a paper on the social history of the people of Q. Careful attention to the layers of tradition in Q's composition made it possible to move from shifts in the group's discourse to stages in the group's social history. Indications of location, dress, behavior, and attitude toward the larger social world could be identified in each stage that agreed with the kind of discourse characteristic for each layer. Analysis of the rhetoric at each stage also brought changes of audience into view, which indicated that the people of Q had experienced changes in their social circumstance. Surprisingly, both Kloppenborg and I agreed in our preliminary descriptions of each stage of the group's social history, as well as with regard to circumstances that must have occasioned the shifts in discourse from stage to stage. In broad outline, the social history of the people of Q began with an early period elan, general social critique, and experimentation with countercultural behavior. Their flippant stance toward standard social conventions is captured in such sayings as leave the dead to bury their dead. Do not worry what you will wear, and lend without expecting anything in return. This period was followed by an attempt to turn some of their unlikely behavior into rules by which to recognize fellow travelers and exemplify an ethos peculiar to the movement. In the harvest instruction, for instance, there is mention of appropriate attire, a sign of greeting, and proper etiquette when being received as a guest. These early periods and the first attempts at spelling out an ethic are documented in Q1. At this stage of collection and composition, the audience largely consisted of those participating in the movement. But then the group experienced a period of frustration with failed expectations. It was this failure that occasioned the language of judgment, which was largely directed towards various sectors of the society that had created obstacles for the movement. This stage of social history is documented in Q2. At some later time, additions were made to the collection that indicate a series of accommodations to other streams of the Jesus movement, as well as to some Jewish and Hellenistic values that had earlier been eschewed. Q3 exhibits a relaxation of the tensions that had accompanied earlier stages of social formation. But who exactly were these people, and what precisely was their movement all about? Returning to the text with these questions in mind, features of its discourse were noticed that had been overlooked in earlier studies. One was that the wisdom sayings of Q1 looked strange when compared with the maxims, proverbs, and injunctions typical for the standard collection of wise sayings. There could be no doubt that the sayings in Q1 were crafted in the forms of wisdom speech and treated as sage instructions. But they did not trade in truisms, principles, and traditional proverbial wisdom. They were decidedly aphoristic, delighting in extreme cases and in imaginary that was more pungent and evocative than observational and instructive. And there was a very large imbalance in favor of imperatives, injunctions, and instruction in specific details of behavior. To call this material sage advice was clearly not sufficient. Something was being recommended other than the wisdom required for well being, either in a conventional society or in a well defined subcultural group. To anticipate what we shall find as we enter the world of the text in part 3, the aphoristic quality of the sayings in Q1 is strikingly reminiscent of speech characteristic of the Greek tradition of Cynic philosophy. This kind of sagery did not intend an elucidation of the way the world usually works in order to recommend fitting attitudes and behavior. Excuse me. Instead, poignant insights explored the embarrassing moments of human relations and the pretensions that traditional wisdom overlooks or seeks to cover up with its rationalizations in favor of conventional social values. New Testament scholars had been aware of the Cynic parallels to a few of the specific attitudes and practices enjoined in Q. As we shall see, these included such things as disentanglement from one's family, voluntary homelessness, eschewing normal standards of cleanliness, simple attire, and unashamed begging. But scholars had always discounted these similarities to the Cynics because they did not fit with the traditional picture of the Christian mission. Now, however, more than a few behavioral similarities to the Cynics began to surface. The aphoristic style in Q1 was very close to the Cynic's way of making pointed comment on human behavior, and the logic involved in recommending extravagant behavior in Q was very close to the rhetoric of a Cynic's repartee when challenged about his own behavior. The forthrightness with which social critique was registered in Q was exactly like that of the Cynic's attitude called parrhesia, or bold, outspoken manner. Aphoristic style, unconventional behavior, and the rhetoric of embarrassment all converged in a critical stance toward the social world that also agreed with Cynic tradition. This stance of social critique was a call for individuals to live against the stream, not a program offered for the reform of society's ills. Thus, the Cynic parallels help us to see that social critique in Q1 was decidedly scattershot and implicit, not pointed and programmatic as if Judaism, the priests, the Pharisees, or the Romans were to blame for the sorry state of the world. Specific social institutions and particular cultural or religious traditions were not under attack. Natural behavior under the circumstances was what counted, not a system of belief or a piety or a reconceptualization of the way the world might work if only certain leaders, institutions, or structures were not in place and in charge. The early Jesus movement was apparently not a reform movement. The cynic parallels seem to subside. However, when turning to the material in Q2, here one encountered prophetic idiom as well as explicit appeal to the epic lore familiar from the Hebrew scriptures. In contrast to Q1, the authority of Jesus was greatly enhanced by association with the mythological figure of wisdom, and by imparting to him the kind of knowledge one had to have in order to make the sweeping judgments and announcements attributed to him. A man named John entered the picture with a message of judgment, together with parables that dealt with exclusion and threatened people with the thought that a strict account of their deeds was being kept. The Pharisees were singled out for castigation in an extensive list of charges against them, and the theme of judgment seemed to climax in an apocalyptic announcement of the day of the Son of Man, an imaginary figure whose judgment would be final at the great trial to come. What would one say about finding these features in Q? Scholars were at a loss. All of these features were familiar themes in the design of the narrative Gospels. In the context of the narrative Gospels, these features had meanings that supported the Gospel story. Why were they popping up in Q at the second stage of composition? With Q disentangled from its narrative Gospel context, these features had no narrative reference to give them significance and were very hard to understand. Some scholars thought we may have been wrong. Perhaps the people of Q had been gospel Christians all along. Scholarly consternation is a lovely sight to behold, especially when the panic is triggered by a major shift in paradigms. In this case, the picture painted by the narrative Gospels had continued to function unbeknownst as the dominant paradigm for imagining Christian beginnings. The story provided by the narrative Gospels was, in fact, the only model scholars had in mind for thinking about the earliest chapters of Christianity. In spite of knowing that Mark's Gospel was a fiction, the setting and logic of his story still served as the frame of reference for understanding the saying and themes in Q2, especially those that clearly overlapped with the Gospels. According to the narrative Gospels, most of these themes should have surfaced in Q1 as reminiscence of Jesus. According to the Gospels, wasn't Jesus baptized by John? Was he not an eschatological prophet of the kingdom of God? Did he not call for the transformation of Israel? Did he not tangle with the Pharisees and threaten them with divine judgment? Was he not crucified by the Jewish authorities? The recent studies of Q suggest otherwise, that Jesus was first remembered as a cynic sage, and cynic is spelled Cynic, and only later imagined as a prophet who uttered apocalyptic warnings. So, what was a poor, confused scholar to do? When confronted with data that does not fit the dominant paradigm, scholars reassess and repeat the experiment. Either the data must be wrong or the paradigm will have to change. Take care, proceed with caution, leave no stone unturned. Such are the signals heard from within. Detailed studies have therefore been devoted to item after item in a list of troublesome Q2 themes during the last 5 years. These are precious studies, for they exhibit a remarkably fresh and candid approach to sayings that had always been taken for granted and interpreted from the gospel point of view. The method has been thorough with respect to the text of Q, critical in the comparison of Q with the Gospels, and open with regard to the way such language worked in the cultures of the time. In every case, these studies have produced results that are similar. A theme that is common both to Q and to the Gospels takes on different meanings in each literary context. When read in Q, these themes are better understood if their gospel connotation is avoided. Thus, the sayings in Q should be studied apart from the narrative gospels. As we shall see in part 3, this is the case with the prophet motif. The apocalyptic idiom, the terminology of the kingdom of God, the theme of discipleship, the castigation of the Pharisees, and a few allusions to death by crucifixion and killing. Interpreting themes such as these solely in the context of the Q document without reference to the Gospels supported the growing suspicion that the people of Q were not Christians. The people of Q did not think of Jesus as a Messiah, did not recognize a special group of trained disciples as their leaders, did not imagine that Jesus had marched to Jerusalem in order to cleanse the temple or reform the Jewish religion, did not regard his death as an unusual divine event, and did not follow his teachings in order to be quote unquote saved or transformed people. The process of defamiliarization has been painful for some. The rewards, however, have been rich indeed. Finally, Q can be understood apart from its gospel context. The people of Q can now be seen as a lively Jesus movement. The Jesus movement can now be placed in its own Galilean environment. And as for Galilee, our understanding of its social and cultural world has also been forced to change. Q and the Jesus movement fit quite nicely into the picture now being painted by the archaeological and sociological analyses of first century life and times in Galilee. You will also be asked to look at the sayings in Q with new eyes. The fresh translation of Q material in part 2 will help, and the explication of the text in part 3 is designed precisely as a revision of the more familiar traditional Christian view. But the traditional picture of Galilean culture also needs to change. In this case, the scholar's advantage is too great, too comprehensive to share easily in the course of ad hoc textual observations. Most readers will have an image of Judaism in Palestine based on the Christian Gospels that will frustrate the attempt to make sense of Q and will seriously inhibit their own process of defamiliarization. This image consists of a set of assumptions about the social, political, and religious world in which the story of Jesus was set. Even if Q is taken out of the narrative frame of the Gospels, this image of Jewish life in Galilee tends to remain in the background and can only be challenged by a full historical redescription. Thus, the following chapter provides some basic, up to date information about the social and cultural climate of first century Galilee. And that finishes up part 3, removing the patina from the Lost Gospel, the book of Q and Christian Origins, read by Rhonda as a reading project. Stay tuned for part 4, which will be Galilee before the war. Thank you for listening.